Well, I'm Peter Sugar. I came to this country back in the 50s on a fellowship to MIT, and I graduated from MIT in the late 50s. And it was interesting because when we first came here, my fellowship asked me to go back to England. That was part of the condition. And I said at the time that when I came through Lincoln, it reminded me very much of an English village, because the green near Pierce House was like a green. Of course, it wasn't used like in England. The green is used as a cricket pitch, but here it was just for public usage. And we said to ourselves, well, if we ever come back to the US, we should love to live in Lincoln. And guess what? We came back in the US, and after first living in Indiana, we came and settled back in Lincoln. And primarily what moved us here was, of course, having the icon Gropius house, which was very impressive. And of course, he had his house, and Master Breuer had his house, and there were other architects who lived there. And we just loved it here. So to my mind, it was very interesting to be so close to the center of, if you like, to Boston, the metropolitan area, and yet you felt like being in the country. And perhaps in a sense it speaks to the vision of some of the people who lived here, who at the time decided that it was worth preserving as a nature preserve. And so there's so much land that's been put aside for conservation that it really is kept its rural character, which is very nice, which is unusual, if you like, for a suburb, if you call it a suburb. But in many ways, people who live here, they all lived here for a long time, and maybe it speaks to the character of the town that it's so desirable that people who live here just don't move away. They tend to live here all the time. So anyhow, what's also interesting, of course, is also like a catalog of architects, because I don't know how many architects live in Lincoln, but there must be tens and tens of them, and they still do. And a lot of them build good houses, and the idea was to make it, have a contemporary sense about it. And yet, I feel now, in some respect, there's a throwback, because some people still are building traditional buildings, and I think and some of them build the so-called mansions, which I think totally out of character, and it's a shame for the whole town. Hasn't happened completely, but I'm always afraid that we're heading in a direction, especially with the economic development of the country, that people who come here now are very well to do, and they feel that they can knock down their old houses and they build new ones. And I just hope that it doesn't, in the long term, loses its whole historic background. Perhaps I'm unnecessarily pessimistic, but I can only hope that there are enough people here who believe in what Lincoln is about, not to have this, to prevent this from happening. So it's the best I can say. I mean, I think from a point of view of, it's an ideal town to build a house in, because you can look out onto conservation land, into gardens, into landscape, and it truly brings the outdoors inside as well. I mean, Gropius was very conscious of that when he built his house, and I happen to be sitting here in this house right now, and I'm looking out onto nature, which is just wonderful. I don't look at built up urban environment as much as I look at the rural character. And I think that's what inspires a lot of architects who lived here, who built here on that particular philosophy, meaning that they united the outdoors and the indoors and made it more of a whole. And that, in a sense, embodies the spirit of contemporary residential building, where you try and open yourself to the outside so you can enjoy both. And I just don't know if that is going to prevail as I said, because I feel that these so-called mansions don't follow that philosophy at all. I think they're pretentious, and it's a pity. I don't know how else to describe it, but just not something that I would be. Well, I live here still, and I'm very happy, but it may be unfortunate that the next generation may not have the same enjoyment because of what happens to the town in the long term. I mean, we're still thinking about the zoning issues and bringing in more housing into Lincoln, which depends on what the character of that will be. I mean, we have a development that was put in many years ago by CERT. That it's a financially supported community that looks very contemporary, but some people are poking fun at it, saying it's flat roofs, it doesn't belong to Lincoln. I don't think that has anything to do with it. If you know what I'm talking about, the Lincoln Woods, and it's right next door, close to the railway station, and now we're talking about adding housing in that area because there's an encouragement from the state of Massachusetts that we should put up more dense urban housing for, if you like, moderate housing, moderate income housing, so it would allow the affordability of people coming live here. But what's the character of these? What is going to be the character of this new development? That's the question. And I'm not as sanguine, if you like, about what might happen just because of looking around. And I think that I find it problematic. Not the development, I'm all for that, but I think that there's a way of doing that. And if you look at some of the European developments where you have terrace housing or public housing, and it's very nicely mixes, if you like, the residential and the commercial and the social aspects of life in the same thing. But I think in this country, I find that those things are kept apart very often. Commercial is one place, residential is somewhere else, commercial is some other place. And I think that is not the way to build a community. I mean, talking about when I was at MIT, it was an extraordinary experience. One of the reasons I came to this country was that I felt that I went to a university college in London where I got my first degree, which was essentially a Beaux-Arts school to start with. And it had a contemporary final years, the final 2 years, where we looked at contemporary architecture, but it was never completely embodied in the educational system of that university at that time. And I felt that unless I came to this country and looked at what contemporary architecture was about, because a lot of the European architects escaping the Second World War came to this country and they established a certain philosophy. I mean, Gropius became the head of Harvard. Others came who were running away from the Nazis, and you know, we had Nitra in the West Coast, and these people established a certain basis on which to develop contemporary architecture, and I think it was taught in the universities here very much. So when I came to MIT, I mean, I could have gone to any university because of my fellowship, but I chose to go to MIT. I was advised to go there because the curriculum there was less rigid than it was at Harvard. Harvard required coursework 95% of the time, and they prescribed exactly what you had to do, whereas MIT required 50% coursework, and 50% was up to you on a more open choice way that you could study certain aspects of whatever you wanted to do. And we had wonderful critics. I mean, we had Kenzo Tanga, for instance, came from Japan. He was one of my critics at the time. We had Doshi from India, and others would come for a week or two and act as critics during that time, when we established some relationship and we worked with these people. The dean, of course, was Pietro Beluschi. He came to MIT, and he was there certainly was there while I was there. Saarinen used to visit. Simon would come. At one time he came and came around the studios and even said to me that if I ever came back to this country, I should go and work for him. Unfortunately, by the time I got back, he died, so I never got there. But that's it, you know. So these traditions, from an architectural standpoint, were very strong, both as an aesthetic and in their aesthetic and what we were trying to do in construction and design. But these days, it's changed, because I think a lot of the architectural education that is taking place has become more mixed, not mixed, but aligned with social issues. So they make the architect responsible sometimes to take very careful note of the social issues when they construct things. And perhaps that's the way to do it. I mean, if you go back historically, a lot of architects working back in the 18th, 16th, 17th centuries, they followed their clients' desires. So the client might have been a potentate or a pope or whatever, who told them, this is what I want, and that's what you did. So in a sense, you might draw a parallel for today's approach as well, saying that, well, the people at large, or your clients, who are often public institutions or municipalities, they say to you, this is what you have to emphasize. These are the things that are critical to us, because we have to work with and for the people amongst whom we live. You can't build a piece of architecture that's like divorced from all of that. And while there were some lines of architecture like building museums that are very individual and therefore could be almost like a work of art by themselves, a lot of the architecture is tied in with the way life has developed and the social issues that it's tied to. So I think that gives a direction which is different maybe from what it was like historically, because in those days it's not the people that seemed to matter. It was your client. It was the beneficiary who wanted you to do it his or her way. Whereas today it's more the political entity that tends to demand a certain way of approaching stuff, which may or may not be, which is different. I shouldn't say it's bad or good, because in development, nothing is bad or good. It develops with life as society develops, and you have to follow that. But then if you look at what that has done, for instance, if you look at Hitler's Germany, where he did this awful prescribed architecture, and in a sense the Russians did exactly the same. You look at in Stalin's days, they built these terrible apartments that all look like rubber stamps, and they're terrible, and the construction is nothing to do, if you like, with any aesthetics as much as it has to do, if you like, with the social issues of providing accommodation for people. And maybe that's the real motivation. How do you solve a social issue while also trying to do your best from an architectural standpoint, from an aesthetic standpoint? I don't think there is a solution yet that has come about that I would say, if I look around, really has happened that way. That's my opinion. But Berlusconi was an interesting man. He was an Italian who lived in the West Coast in Portland, Oregon, and had a wonderful practice. He built mostly a lot of churches in wooden construction, and that was his forte. But then as he became better known and moved out of that into larger projects, if you like, he changed somewhat, because what happened was that he then became an advisor to other architects, managed to get, because of his own name, commissions like office buildings or whatever, where the other person, the other architect, was actually doing the design, and Pietro could put in his own views and try and influence the end result. So in a sense, he, in my opinion, at that time did not practice his own particular philosophy as well as he might have. And if you look at his earlier work, I think it's extraordinary and very, very well done and put together. When you look at later work, like you look at the Pan Am building, for instance, above Grand Central, you could, well, Belusky's name is on that building as well, but frankly, it's I don't think it really embodies anything that he really would himself contributed as much as, I don't know what he did in terms of advice, what advice he gave to the architects who built that building, but to my mind, his own personality doesn't come through anymore. That's the issue with some of the later work where he's associated with it. I mean, he also built the cathedral in San Francisco, which in a sense is interesting, and he built that together with Eduardo Catalano, very interesting structural fusion, if you like, of structural ideas with aesthetic ideas for that cathedral. And those sort of things, I think, are less prevalent in his later work when he acted more as an advisor to other firms. So, well, Eduardo was really, I think, one of the most influential people in my life in terms of architecture. And he also had a very good sense of humor. And what was good about him is that he was not afraid to tell you what he thought of what you were doing. He would say, if he didn't like, but it's ugly, he would look at what you've done and he would say this, no good. But then he would sit down with you at the table and would sketch with you. And he was very astute and very sharp in immediately looking at what you were doing and being able to synthesize the issues in your particular work to the point that he probably wouldn't see more than 2 or 3 or 4 people at a time in a day, because he would spend that much time and he would take a lot of mental. It would make him overly tired if he did more than that. And, he had to stay sharp. And I thought, in working with him, you got a much better sense of the direction you should be doing and taking, and what mattered most in coming up with the concept, and be, if you like, consistent in your approach, in your design approach to a particular project. And I worked very closely with him to the point that eventually became very good friends. And when I moved away from this area for a while, he sort of wanted me to come back. And at one point he finally said, well, I can't offer you much, but we would like to have you. So I came back when I came back to the East Coast and started working with him, and became very, very close. And we had a long history together of working, even in later life when he retired. If he had something to do, he often came back to me to help him work and develop the drawings with him, because he respected the way I could actually acquire somewhat his philosophy. When we came to work on the courthouse and city hall project down in Greensboro, North Carolina, I was the associate architect on that project with him. People used to say sometimes that you're just like Eduardo. And in a sense, it made me feel very good, because it meant that perhaps I absorbed enough of what mattered to him, and in a sense it influenced my own particular thinking as well. And we went on like that. But Eduardo was one of the most talented architects who came from Argentina in his earlier life, and he was written up at the time as being one of the 10 most talented architects, upcoming architects. And I think there was an article on him in that vein. I think it was in Time magazine. And he initially went to North Carolina State University, and was a critic there. And I think Belusky got him to come up to Cambridge, and he acted as a visiting critic, worked at Harvard as well as MIT. In final analysis, he got the job of being a senior lecturer and critic at MIT. This is just how I met him. But he was an extraordinary person, and he lived a long life and did some very good, wonderful work, and he had wonderful projects. He was also a very straight arrow, as I call him. He never suffered fools, if you might say, and he certainly didn't accept unethical proposals. I mean, he was offered a job once in London, a hospital project, and he accepted the charge. He went over and they started the meeting, and they told him this and that. I don't know all the details. At a certain point, he realized that this wasn't going the right way. He got up and said, "You're all crooks," and he walked out. He dropped the commission, didn't want to do anything with these people because of their unethical ideas. So he felt that ethics was part of doing good work. You don't do work because that may bring you more money. You don't do work where the essence of the project has to do with income or anything like that. He did the work because architecturally it was the right thing for that particular project. It was the right program to develop. That mattered to him a great deal. And I think he kept that philosophy going, to the point that some people who worked with him, actually he didn't necessarily like what those people did and tell them so, which maybe didn't sit down too well with some of these people, but Eduardo didn't mind. The essence was his ethics. What you thought, how you thought, what mattered, and that was the guiding light. Nothing else. Everything else is immaterial. So that was critical to him.
And Buzz Brannan was...
Well, Buzz, I don't know Buzz too much. Buzz is a good friend of mine, but Buzz, I don't know much about his architecture other than he opened his own office because Pietro offered Buzz the ability to have his own office, because, as I said, when Pietro became better known, he would bring projects to other firms and act, if you like, as somewhat of a senior advisor to the particular project, but didn't actually do the design work. And he saw enough of Buzz's abilities to say, okay, you open the office. And then at one point, Pietro's own son, Tony Belusky, also worked with Buzz in his office until Tony left and did his own work later. So that's, and I still know Tony. I see him because he now is retired, lives on the West Coast in Portland, Oregon, and lives in a house that his father designed. And I visit with him every time I go out there. So it's really nice. Yes. Well, I built when I moved here to Lincoln in 1970. We bought the lot and I built the house, and it was finished in 1971. And it was a very interesting project because it was on a very steep hillside, which some people say, well, you can't really build on such a thing. And I said, to my mind, actually, it was an inspiration, because what it meant is that you could design a house in such a way that even that had several floors, you could walk out of each floor onto the ground by making the axis of the house follow the contours, rather than go against them at right angles, follow them in parallel, which meant that as you stepped up the hill, you could walk out of each of the levels onto ground. Anyhow, that inspired my house, and part of the house had to do also with, number one, sitting on the hillside, as well as bringing in the light from up above and flooding the house with a lot of wonderful light, but not necessarily direct sunlight. Well, when I finished the house, Eduardo came, because he and I worked at that time, I was in his office. He thought the house was really, really good. I mean, he complimented me. He thought it was really a very well designed house. And in some respects, I think that the way I treated light and the way I brought it into the house, maybe this is how shall I put it, an arrogance on my part, but I felt that Eduardo was somewhat accepting the idea of how to deal with natural light in his own design. I shouldn't say that perhaps, but if you went to his house, which is in Cambridge, was his house, it does have some of those characteristics. Now, whether Eduardo would have done it anyhow, whether I learned from him in the first place, it's very hard to say, because we worked together. But when I worked with Eduardo, I did mostly very large projects, courthouses and stuff like that. Never did a house, and so I built my own house, and then he did his house. So what can you say? It's hard to tell. But that was the issue.